Hello and welcome to Jesuitical, a podcast from America Media for saints and sinners. You can join us each week for honest conversations about the Catholic Church and our world today, sometimes over drinks. I'm Ashley McKinless, and I'm joined again by Sebastian Gomes.
Hey, Ashley, good to be with you again. I think this is our final week together.
At least for now.
At least for now. That is if Zach comes back.
Yes.
He might not. That's still TBD.
From what I've seen, he's quite enjoying his paternity leave, as he should. And as happy as we are for Zach, we do have a bit of a heavy, poignant conversation this week. I'm sure everyone listening to this knows by now about the assassination on September 10th of the conservative activist and podcaster Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, so we decided to bring on some of the senior editorial staff for a conversation. Actually, you have it with Father Sam Sawyer, who's our editor-in-chief, and JD Long-Garcia, who's a senior editor at America, just to reflect on this from maybe a slightly different perspective than people might have been seeing primarily on social media or even on, mainline news channels. This is obviously like a hugely important socio-political, event. But at the same time, there's deep spiritual underpinnings to how we're all processing this.
Yeah, so I know there are some listeners who probably have maybe only heard about Charlie Kirk recently or have been following him for a long time and have pretty strong criticisms of his approach to politics or have been offended or even deeply hurt by things he had said. But that's not where we're focusing this conversation. Whatever you disagreed with Charlie Kirk about, hopefully you agree with him that political violence is never the answer. And so our starting point for this conversation is Charlie Kirk as a man, a husband, a father, a child of God, and kind of, our fears for where our country is going after this tragic political event. So just wanted to kind of set the stage for the conversation that way.
Yeah, so that conversation between you and Father Sam and JD is coming up as our main conversation in the show this week. And because you guys touch on a lot of deeply spiritual themes, and all of you are quite vulnerable in different ways talking about how you're processing this spiritually, we're not going to do a faith sharing segment this week. We're just going to let that stay in the feed.
But first, we have Signs of the Times, the part of the show where we sift through the Catholic news of the week so you don't have to. And as we said before, we're not the only ones who are commenting and reacting to this news. One person who weighed in was Bishop Oscar Solis. He's the Bishop of Salt Lake City, Utah. And in the wake of Charlie's killing, he prayed for Charlie and all those affected by the assassination. But he also prayed for all victims of gun violence. This obviously came just 2 weeks after that horrible shooting of 2 young children at a Minneapolis Catholic school. And he also made a pretty pointed call to politicians. He said, quote, "It seems that our society has lost the sense of the sanctity of life. And I pray that our government will undertake appropriate measures to stop these horrible crimes."
Yeah, powerful words there from the local bishop where Charlie was killed. And there are other high-profile Catholics on both sides of the political aisle, really, who have denounced the killing and offered prayers. So maybe we'll start by mentioning that Vice President J.D. Vance, who's Catholic and was a close friend of Kirk's, he asked God to protect Charlie in this darkest hour. And on the day after the killing, he and his wife actually flew Air Force Two to Utah to accompany Charlie's casket along with his wife back to their home state in Arizona.
And on the Democratic side, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who's also Catholic, strongly denounced the killing, calling it disgusting, vile, and reprehensible. And Governor Newsom actually had some personal encounter with Charlie, who went on the governor's podcast back in March. And, it was a sign that they both were people who were open to dialogue across strong differences. And Governor Newsom even admitted to Charlie that his own son was a big fan of Charlie Kirk. So even, the progressive governor of California has family members who got a lot of meaning from Charlie Kirk.
That's right. And in case you're wondering if word has gotten to Pope Leo, of course it has, but we did get confirmation from the Holy See press office that Pope Leo is in fact praying for Charlie Kirk. On Saturday, actually, he was receiving the credentials of the new U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, which is news in itself. It's conservative activist Brian Birch. And the Pope said that he's praying for Charlie, his wife, his children, as I said, and, quote, expressed concern about political violence and spoke of the need to refrain from rhetoric and exploitation or instrumentalization that lead to polarization rather than dialogue. So Pope Leo trying to tone down the temperature a little bit.
And Charlie Kirk's memorial service will be held at State Farm Stadium in Glendale, Arizona this Sunday beginning at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And both President Trump and Vice President Vance are scheduled to attend. And now we'll move to some Vatican news.
That's right. I think we mentioned this last week that there was this historic Grace for the World concert happening in St. Peter's Square, and it was quite the spectacle.
Yeah, it really was. So, as we said last week, it was produced by songwriter Pharrell Williams and the Italian tenor Andrea Bocelli. And it was quite the spectacle to behold. Like, they packed St. Peter's Square. There was this incredible light drone show behind St. Peter's Basilica. They were showing scenes from inside the Sistine Chapel. At one point, there was a ginormous bust of Pope Francis made up of lights. And I think this was the first time rappers have ever performed at the Vatican, including the hip-hop duo Clips, and our own O'Hare fellow Edward Desiak wrote an article in anticipation of this performance. And it actually got some attention from Clips, who posted the article on their Instagram story. So shout out to Ed for that great work.
Congratulations, Ed. That's amazing. And I just wanted to say something about the drone show. What really stood out to me is when we hear about drones, when we think about drones today, it's often in the context of war, right? Dropping bombs, killing people. And this show, I mean, apart from it just being astonishingly impressive, how they were like moving and creating all these pictures, the Pietà and like the creation of Adam through the movement of these drones, I just thought to myself, what a powerful statement to the world that this is a much better way, a more fraternal way of using the amazing technologies that humans are capable of developing.
Yeah, for sure. And the day after that historic concert was Pope Leo's 70th birthday. Do we know if he attended the concert? Are there any pictures of him?
I don't know. We'll have to ask Colleen to confirm.
Yeah. But in addition to celebrating the Pope's birthday, we got excerpts from the first interview that Leo has done since becoming Pope. It was with Elise Ann Allen, the senior correspondent at the Catholic publication Crux. And what did we learn, Sebastian?
Well, at this point, we only have some excerpts from them that they published on their website, which we'll link to in the show notes. I think the book is coming out first in Spanish, and it should be out, I think, this week. We're recording this on Wednesday. I think it might be coming out tomorrow. And then the English version of the book is coming out later. But this is a really, really important moment because it's the first interview with Pope Leo. And the fact that he's a native English speaker makes it extra interesting because you can hear the little like nuances. They released a few clips on YouTube as well of the video of the interview, so you can hear the nuances about how he's thinking about and talking about different things. But just a couple of highlights. He did talk about his deep affection for Peru and Latin America.
He even said that if it was between America and Peru in the World Cup, he'd have to root for Peru.
That's right. And he did acknowledge that there is a steep learning curve to becoming Pope. Yeah, no kidding. But at one point he says, quote, "I'm learning a lot and feeling very challenged, but not overwhelmed." So that's consoling to the 1.4 billion of us who are praying for him.
Yeah, and one of the quotes that got a lot of attention was his comment about income inequality and billionaires and, CEOs now making 600 times what the average worker makes. And he pointed specifically to Elon Musk, noting that he could soon become the world's first trillionaire. And he pointed at this deep inequality as a source of polarization in the world.
That's right. And he also highlighted my favorite buzzword, synodality, as the antidote to that polarization. So,
what can't synodality solve?
So by the time you're hearing this, the whole interview will be available in Spanish, but I think there's an English translation as well. But we have full coverage at America. So head over to americamagazine.org. to learn more, and we'll link to it in the show notes.
And now stick around for our conversation with Father Sam Sawyer and J.D. Long-Garcia about the assassination of Charlie Kirk and what it means for our country. Joining me in studio is Father Sam Sawyer, America's editor-in-chief. Thanks for being here, Sam.
Good to be here.
And joining from Phoenix, Arizona, is J.D. Long-Garcia, a senior editor here at America. Hey, J.D.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks, you both, for being here. I think like a lot of people, I'm having trouble processing all of this. And so having people like you to work through it with me is really helpful, and hopefully will be helpful to our audience. I've been finding it difficult to talk about because what I want is for us to live in a world where we could say this is a tragedy. A human being was lost, a father, a husband. This is a tragedy for his family, and political violence is never acceptable, and just end it there because that should be enough. But because of who he was and how this killing happened, it's also a national tragedy and something with political implications. But before we get to those other questions, I want to linger on the personal aspect of this tragedy for a bit. And JD, I want to start with you. You've talked about watching this unfold as a father. So what have you been experiencing in this last week?
Yeah, I've been surprised at how deeply I've been affected by this. I would not count myself as part of Charlie Kirk's primary audience. I'm no longer in college, but I also wasn't very familiar with his work, despite living, in the same state that he did and that his family does. But I think for me, a big part of it is thinking about the great loss to his family. And what, I have young children as well, and what it would mean to my family and to my children if I wasn't around anymore. And so I think that for a lot of us who have experienced loss of a loved one, I think that in itself is something that connects a lot of Americans to what's happened and a lot of Catholics to what's happened. But then on top of that, to see it in such a violent way and such a public way, I somewhat on accident saw the video once, one of the more graphic videos of his shooting, and I haven't been able to erase it from my mind. It sticks to your mind in a particular way, and you confront the violence of it and the tragedy of what actually happened in a way that we may not have done decades ago. It's a different reality and a different way that we're processing this and grieving this, I think, as a nation.
What about you, Sam?
Well, so I think, echoing JD in some ways, not in a situation of violence, but I lost my father when I was young, when I was 5 years old. And so I've also been thinking about what it means for his family, for his wife, for his children. And I also think, as you said, Ashley, that desire for there ought to be a moment, and there hasn't been in this situation, where we could simply acknowledge the tragedy of a sudden and violent and terrible death, and pray for his family and acknowledge the tragedy and denounce political violence, and then pause. I try to remind myself that those things have happened, right? Like there has been an expression of concern for his family from across the political spectrum. There has been a denunciation of political violence from across the political spectrum. It's just that it's happened in this also supercharged moment of rhetoric that's made it very hard to sift out having one reaction without also trying to figure out what this means in the long range politically, and what your judgment is about what every other bit of rhetoric about the whole thing adds up to at the same time. So, but I definitely feel that desire there ought to be a way to acknowledge the tragedy without having to instantly process all of it into, what is our political judgment about it. But there hasn't been in this moment.
No, and there is this uniquely American phenomenon now, it feels like, when there's a horrific shooting and there's a few hours before we know who did it, where even before we know who did it, there's this instinct, you want to know who to blame.
Right.
That's a natural thing when tragedy or injustice occurs, is to see where the source of it is. But it does kind of cut short the reflection on, the mystery of evil. And, we live in a broken world, and there's not a clear line between what someone said and some horrific event like this.
Right. Those things are all true, that we live in a broken world and we have to confront the mystery of evil. But I think, the fact is those are not answers. That's naming part of the mystery, because sin isn't meant to make sense. It isn't meant to be explicable and rational. And so, the fact that we find those answers unsatisfying, I think, is in most cases a sign of a kind of spiritual health, right? Like if we got those answers and said, oh, okay, well then that's fine then, that would be terrible. That'd be even worse. Yeah. So I think we should feel a dissatisfaction with those answers, because it means we're facing pretty squarely how broken things actually are.
I'm not immune from this. I, like a lot of people, spent way too much time on social media in the wake of this killing. And just because of, who I follow and how the algorithm has gotten to know me, I saw all of every terrible thing that someone on the left said about Charlie was fed onto my social media feed. And I couldn't help but feel angry and to feel like, it's the people like you that are to blame. And I know that's not a spiritually healthy response, but I'm not sure how to best avoid it.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I think certainly recognizing that a lot of it is induced by the filter bubble and the algorithms that are feeding us content very often that's designed to outrage us, because that gets us to engage further. Recognizing that is important. A specific person took a very evil act here. And so in that sense, there is something to blame there. There's an injustice that happened. That injustice should not have happened and deserves to be denounced, right? It deserves to be rejected. But I think very often we're seeking this sense of security or control, that if we can only put it in a larger picture and fix something that went wrong like 2 or 3 or 4 steps back, then that would somehow solve the problem more thoroughly, right? When I sit down and pray with this kind of thing, it's that instinct of, if only I could have gone 2 or 3 or 4 steps back, and if everyone had listened to me, right? If everyone had done what I thought was the right thing to do back then we wouldn't be here. That often, I think, is where the sort of the spiritually unhealthy illusion of control comes from, right? That I had a way to avoid this.
Yeah. JD, I'm curious how you experience the reactions to the assassination. You mentioned not knowing too much about Charlie before his killing. What about now?
I know a lot more about him, and a lot about his faith, which I didn't realize, and he has been held up as a person of faith. It's natural, I think, to feel angry at injustice and the taking of this person's life in this, in any way maybe, but certainly in this way it was unjust. So there's a natural, maybe angry could be a natural response to that, and that's part of mourning and all of that. But there's also anger, regrettably, is typical of our political discourse these days. So there's almost like an immediate overlap with it, where the anger that we might feel at an injustice gets like channeled in a particular way in political ways. So I don't know. This is very difficult to understand, and even at the end of the day, like for many of us, I hope for most of us, that we don't understand what would drive someone to take this action against someone. That might be just something we can never understand, but we do understand the tragedy and the pain and the suffering of this family that this family is going through, and of his many supporters, and how they must be suffering through this. So I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult to kind of weigh what kind of anger is appropriate here, especially when anger too often these days, I think, is channeled and maybe even manipulated in a particular direction for not for mourning, right? We're not using anger for mourning, but like for some sort of political gain, and that's difficult to. I mean, that's difficult to swallow.
Well, and just to tag on to that, JD, I think often one of the stock things in particularly in sort of like short social media posts, and I think this is also a feeling that comes when you see them all, all listed together, just this endless scroll of them, is the message we get. In some cases, the message we're meant to get is you're not angry enough, right? You should be even more angry than you are, and that, I think, that's a hole with no bottom.
Yeah. I kind of mentioned this at the top of, wishing it could be a simple conversation, but of course it hasn't been. But one thing I've noticed, and that has frustrated me in a lot of the reactions of those who are not on the same political side as Charlie Kirk, is the like, this is terrible, but, or having to feel like you have to say, I deeply disagreed with Charlie Kirk, but this is still terrible. And on one hand, I understand that, and I think if it was a different person who, like, who I considered a political enemy, I would probably have that same instinct. But at the same time, I kind of recoil from it. But maybe I just need to have more empathy for the people who were bigger critics of him than I was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any systematic way to assess this, because I feel like I certainly recognize the pattern you describe, like Charlie Kirk's death is a tragedy, but I feel like I've also seen plenty of people on the left who haven't had that, who haven't needed a coda, who've just been able to say Charlie Kirk's death is a tragedy and political violence is never acceptable, and leave it at that. There is no political speech that would justify shooting someone. Clearly not, right? But there's still political speech involved, and I think the question this asks the country, maybe this is the way I would put it, I think this is maybe a slightly healthier question than trying to figure out what do I think or what ought someone else think about Charlie Kirk's own political positions, whatever the list of them were. But instead to say, what does it say about the state of political discussion and political argument in the U.S. that we are so deeply divided, and that violence has, in this case, so that division has, in this case, turned to violence.
Yeah. If I can also say, I think that the people's reactions demonstrates that division, right? Because there is that rush to say, this is terrible, but because we're so disconnected from each other. We've it tends to be two sides. One side is so far against the other that even expressing sympathy for your political opposition is difficult. You can't do that just in an unqualified way. We're in such a place of division that we can't do that. We always have to be sympathetic with caveats now because we're so divided, and we don't want the people that maybe we align ourselves with politically. We don't want to be seen by them as taking it easy on the other side for any particular reason. The reactions themselves can only be understood through that lens, I think.
Yeah.
And I would also say there's, on the one hand, there's the shooting cannot be justified, but, or this is a tragedy, but. And on the other hand, there's the shooting cannot be justified and this is a tragedy, and we ought to go root out and, everybody who's associated with the left-wing ideology that the shooter seemingly held is therefore a traitor or also bears some responsibility for Charlie Kirk's death. And that kind of sort of contagion of responsibility and that looking for someone to blame, they're mirror image reactions across the political spectrum where we can't just name the tragedy, but have to instantly go to the next step of assigning political blame or diffusing, like defending ourselves from political blame instantly.
Yeah, and there's free speech has become a topic of discussion, and I've named my discomfort with immediately going to the criticisms of Charlie Kirk, but that doesn't mean you should not be allowed to, or that the government should come after you, and depending on the situation, you should be fired from your job. But there is this tension, like there's most humans don't like to speak ill of the dead, but I also don't want to tell anyone you can't say that. I guess what I would say is, like, imagine Charlie's kids when they're 15 reading
Right.
what you said about him in the days after his death.
But as you're saying, the principle "do not speak ill of the dead" is a matter of, it's a matter of virtue and charity. It's not a matter of,
Right.
it's not a matter we legislate.
Yeah. JD, you mentioned being struck by Charlie Kirk's Christian faith, and Christianity has been evoked a lot in the wake of his assassination, largely by the people who supported him. I'm curious how you've seen that played out, whether you think has been a healthy way of pointing to his faith, and using it as a rallying point in the wake of his death.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have noticed, for example, that like there's some people that are speculating about his connection with the Catholic Church, and whether or not he attended a Catholic church here in Phoenix, and that his wife attended Notre Dame Prep here in Scottsdale, and whether or not she still practices the Catholic faith. Usually, when people are talking about that, it's because they support the person, right? Like, so if you're talking about J.D. Vance's Catholic faith, there's a good chance that you like J.D. Vance, right? His opponents don't always bring that up, right? So I think there's a way in which the people that talk about his faith, that's a way of showing appreciation or loss, because they find some sort of commonality with him. And maybe they're, in the better moments, they're using the faith as a way to mourn or to find meaning. I mean, there is something very deep about our faith that we find meaning in suffering, and this is certainly a moment like that. But I've also seen it and experienced in things that I've read and claims that have been made to justify things that I don't consider particularly Christian at all. They're quite divisive, so I think that it's problematic. Sam has mentioned a number of times that most of the leaders' reactions to this has been appropriate on both sides, right? Like, it isn't this broad thing that there are some people that in some ways are mourning his death in the appropriate way. And I hope we can still say that there are those individuals that are using his faith in inappropriate ways to cause more division and to promote intolerance, which is not a Christian virtue. So I think that it's complicated, and it's been less than a week here when we're recording this. So I think there's a lot that we're processing and a lot that's yet to be seen in the reaction. Yeah.
I think another thing that's going on in the way that faith is getting brought up in remembering Charlie Kirk and in talking about, what's going on, what his shooting means. His faith was a motivator for him, for the values he held and espoused politically, which isn't to say that it was identical with his faith, but certainly they were connected. And very often, and I think this is a place where he connected with a lot of people, that faith was a motivator for him to hold positions that in many spaces got him rejected, right? Or in many spaces would have him castigated as not being right thinking, or someone who should not be allowed in this space. He was certainly one of the great opponents of so-called cancel culture on university campuses, and he connected having a visible witness to Christian faith as part of that experience for him. So I think there's also a tendency, and an understandable one, in the aftermath of a tragedy like that, to hold him up as someone who stood up for his values. And he did stand up for his values, and no one should have to do that at the cost of their own life. But there's a desire, I think, to honor the witness to faith there, but also one that can sometimes almost celebrate the persecution of it in a way, right? Like, the persecution becomes a ratification of the bravery. And that we can see that happen all over the place. But I would hope that, we could take a beat, spend some time mourning before we jump to, before we jump to that next level of analysis, and also be careful about how much we let Christianity be sort of identified with one political position or another exclusively.
Yeah, I've seen a good amount of talk about, Charlie Kirk as a martyr because, as you said, he stood up for what he believed, and he was killed in the very act of standing up for what he believes. I can see how that could be dangerous because, in outside the Christian world, a martyr can be a reason to fight other people and go to war.
Right.
And that's not what it is in the Christian faith. So I don't know, is there a way do you find that language problematic, or could it be a push to, if you're calling him a martyr, here, remember what it means to be a martyr in the Christian sense of the word?
I guess I would say I don't think it's appropriate to use martyrdom in a political context.
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous. I think we nearly entirely lose the deeper Christian sense of what martyrdom means, because the word martyrdom means witness, but it also in Christianity means identification with and union with the suffering of Christ on the cross, which was not a suffering that ever sought retaliation. It was not a suffering that claimed victory by force. When martyrdom gets invoked in a political context and then gets used as a way to shout down or shut down one's political enemies, then I think we are going very far away from the cross of Christ at that moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a danger when religion and politics are conflated, because then there's a certain fundamentalism. It does feel like our politics have become religious now, and in such a way that, like, we are talking about political assassinations as martyrdom. That kind of exemplifies that. But also in such a way that, like, in the worst sense of religion, right? That a fundamentalism that doesn't tolerate opposition. That, like, we have a history of that in our own church, right? With the Inquisition. But there isn't any reason to justify this kind of violence toward each other, and those negative aspects that we've seen in the history of religion on Earth, if those get taken up in our political discourse, I mean, it'll end conversations. We're not going to be talking to each other anymore. We're dealing with caricatures of each other and not really listening to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think JD is right that there are definitely senses in which politics have become, religious in sort of the worst sense of the word religious. They've become politics has become a totalizing identity claim that, suddenly means everything about you, right? And leaves you very little room to interact with those who don't share the same identity claims as you're making in your politics. And that also makes it, when people get identified as, like, here's our side, which embodies the true and the good and the beautiful, and then there's the other side that wants to destroy the true and the good and the beautiful, I think that ratchets us towards a politics of destruction, which is not to say, not to assign blame in political discourse for this is what got Charlie Kirk killed. But I do think that there's a level of, sort of all or nothing kind of rhetoric in our politics that is certainly not good for our politics, and I doubt is good for anything else either.
Yeah. This, when it happened, felt almost like a culmination of whatever the last 10 years of politics, but in reality there have been many what could have been culminations that you would hope would break the fever. So I'm wondering how you situate this in the longer history of political violence in modern U.S. politics.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying I am sure I'm going to miss something in this list.
Yeah.
In my own reaction to this, and even though it's not political violence as such, I certainly couldn't help but see this in light of the Annunciation school shooting, the shooting at the school-wide mass in Minneapolis only a couple weeks before. There was also a school shooting in Colorado that same morning. So, like, that specter of just the ongoing commonality, like the disgusting and tragic frequency of gun violence in the U.S. That's in the background. There's the targeted assassination of the Democratic state lawmaker Melissa Hortman. Before that, if we go back before that, there was the arson attack on Governor Josh Shapiro in my home state of Pennsylvania. There's the shooting attempt at Steve Scalise, in the Republican leadership in the House, I think back in 2017 or something. And then, of course, there's also there's January 6th, 2021, and this violent mob at the Capitol rejecting the results of a Democratic election. And I think depending on where you start that account, it's going to have a lot to do with where your instinct on, which political side bears more of the blame or ought to bear more of the blame. That'll determine a lot about where you start that account. But I think the fact that we're sadly divided and the fact that those divisions seem less and less resolvable by compromise or resolvable by sort of the standard constitutional means that we have available in our democracy. I think that's where we are, and that the temperature has been going up for a long time.
Yeah, the killing happened the day before September 11th, which might be the last tragedy that actually brought the country together in the wake of it. JD, I'm curious if you were surprised that it didn't have more of a unifying effect, not discounting that most political leaders have responded in helpful ways, but still we are seeing this being exploited by people to further the divisions in this country. Were you surprised by that? You're unlike us. You're in more of a flip state.
I suppose I wasn't surprised. I think that this feels different to me because he wasn't an elected official. He didn't seem like the type of person that would necessarily be targeted in this way, and that's a little startling. When I think about the assassination attempts against President Trump, I think about, not that it was expected necessarily, but he was running for president. But I was thinking about this young lady in Charlotte too, and that was last week. She was stabbed to death in the bus, and it's been a lot. We've been processing a lot of these tragedies, and it's easy to get numb to them, I guess. But it does feel like there's just this stream that's coming through with the school shootings and other deaths, and some of which we see, we're able to witness through our screens. But it's a political assassination of a person that's not an elected politician, and I don't know if we've had that before in this country. And he wasn't running for office or anything like that, and that I think it really points to the reaction afterwards, points to a larger conversion that needs to take place. I think that when we talk about there's efforts now about, we're going to have legislation coming out and we're going to come after you if you say negative things about Charlie Kirk. That's not going to fix anything. That's not, those kinds of laws don't fix things. What we're really talking about, and I think where the church can come in, is in this conversion of heart that needs to take place, where we're not so divided against each other, and where our first assumption about a person who disagrees with us politically is that they're our enemy. And I don't know how to change that other than through faith or through prayer or by the grace of God. But I think that's the only thing that's going to get us out of here, because the legislating, you can't legislate forgiveness, right? You can't legislate this kind of conversion of heart that needs to take place.
By coincidence, I was writing a scripture reflection for America. Everyone on staff writes those, and I was writing it just hours before Charlie Kirk was shot, and it was going to be published the next morning. And it happened to be the passage in the gospel about loving your enemies. So it came out the next day. Some readers might have thought I was responding to the killing, but it was in fact written beforehand. But I think it might have some spiritual insight. I hope it's not completely theologically incorrect. But I make the point in the article, or the reflection, that God doesn't tell us to love our enemies as this extreme moral character test, but rather because he wants all of us to be his children and to be with him in heaven. And if you get to heaven and you are in an eternity worshiping a God that loves Charlie Kirk or loves the person who killed Charlie Kirk, it might not feel like heaven. That might not be someone you want to spend an eternity with. And if it's not, that's what Jesus is challenging us to do each day, is just try a little bit more to love your enemy, to will their good, so that you can be more like Jesus and the Father.
Yeah, there's reminds me of this fairly well-known quote from Dorothy Day: "I really only love God as much as the person I love the least." Yeah. But I think it is that transformation of heart, right? That loving your enemies, the call on us is not, sort of like white knuckle it through and force yourself to love someone who you actually secretly really hate. The call is to let that hate be drained out of our souls, to let that hate die. Similarly, I would say, exactly the point you're making, Ashley, like Jesus from the cross saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," is not just giving us a good example, like putting a brave face on his suffering on the cross so that we'll know that we're supposed to forgive. He's actually forgiving. That's actually what's in his heart. And that's how our hearts are called to be shaped as well. It's not like an extreme moral character test, but it is a radically transformative moral vision, yeah. Right? It asks for much more than most of us are able or willing to give in the moment when we first encounter it. And I think, we should be very conscious of the danger of sort of domesticating the gospel call to love your enemies into something that's like, like think nice thoughts about them, or hope that they ultimately come to agree with you, or something like that.
Or just don't tweet terrible things about them.
Right. And please don't tweet terrible things about them.
Yeah.
But the call to love your enemies is transformative in this very profound and costly way. I think that most of us are not willing to take love of enemies as far as Jesus took it. And that is what we are called to do, in fact.
It occurs to me along those lines that what Pope Francis called us to as a church is this culture of encounter, and what happens in those moments of encounter with people who we may think are our enemies. And I was reading, and some of the things that I've been reading about Charlie Kirk, for example, like Bill Maher, who would be his political opponent, said very nice things about him, that he's a very nice guy, and that he was mourning his death. He was just on his show, I guess. And then other people who talked about getting text messages from Charlie Kirk after they made an appearance somewhere, sort of these encouraging words that they would hear from this guy. And I, like I say, I mean, I've learned a lot more about Charlie Kirk after his death than I knew before. But those moments of interaction, at least, there was some sort of face-to-face encounter that was happening on these college campuses, and I think that there's some part of that we need to continue with. We need to keep coming together face-to-face and not rely on just digital ways of communication, but these face-to-face, getting to know people, that we end up talking about things that aren't politics, right? Mm-hmm. Like even if it's baseball, or if it's the weather, or if it's where you went to school, or your folks, or your in-laws, even whatever. But there's all these things that we have in common as human beings. Too often we prioritize our political points of view, which, Sam, you're talking about political identity earlier. Too often we find we're prioritizing things in our discourse that are things that we are divided about. But in those moments of encounter, like of breaking bread, or having other interactions with each other that are face to face, that's not always what you're talking about. So I think that'll help. At some time, that these people aren't actually your enemies. Loving your enemies, you find that they're maybe not as different from you as you thought at the beginning.
Well, and I think one of the things that's been very challenging here, and I think it's part of the nature of our very fractured and algorithmically driven media environment, But on the one hand, you have, and I think there's been a lot of praise, and understandably so, for Charlie Kirk for going into spaces where his views wouldn't always be welcome, and engaging in vigorous and often, civil debate there. But at the same time, those in-person events where there might be this moment for deeper encounter, or at least the recognition of common humanity and a shared space of civil discourse, those same events were also often digested down and turned into, short form videos that kind of demonstrate a political victory, or, like trouncing your enemies. And then that's, consumed almost as like, entertainment in the media ecosystem. And so, which is not to say, it's not to say that one of those things has to be exclusively true and the other thing can't be true at all. But it is to say that, like, there's a complicated reality there of, on the one hand, there can be a commitment to and an engagement in discourse, and on the other hand, there can be a use of some of that discourse in ways that actually makes discourse harder to sustain, that makes human encounter feel less possible rather than more possible.
This past Sunday, we celebrated the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, and you wrote an article for America that, asked the question, what can we take from the cross in this moment? Mm-hmm. What's one spiritual takeaway that you would want our listeners to have?
The main thing I would say is that somebody actually replying in the comments put it this way, and I forget who they were quoting, but the cross is where violence goes to die. That is part of the insight I'm trying to name here, that the reflecting on the Feast of the Holy Cross, I was preparing a homily at the same time as I was writing this column, so those two things were together in my head and in my prayer. And the readings were given for the Feast of the Holy Cross. The Old Testament reading starts off with the Israelites in the desert, and they're set upon by serpents, so they're getting bitten and dying. And the cure God gives them is an image of a bronze serpent raised up on a pole. When they look at it, they're healed. And then Jesus in the gospel says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And so I think there's really, in Jesus being lifted up on the cross, there's an invitation for us to look at how violence really operates, look at what violence really does. So to see in Jesus's broken body, the weight of sin, the pattern of our own destruction of ourselves and of each other, and then to be healed of it by having it revealed for what it is. And Jesus does that not by domination, not by saying, not just by denouncing the violence and casting it out, but by suffering it and by transforming it through his own death. And so I think that's really what the cross gives us. It gives us not just a defeat of violence, but a defeat of violence by encountering it and letting it be revealed as the non-answer that it is, right? That violence cannot achieve anything on its own. Seeing the video of Charlie Kirk being shot, seeing that image of violence repeated over and over again, or pick your image of violence that has just been, delivered to you via screen more times than you wanted. It runs the risk of being an idol. It's trying to claim worship from us. And it's not offering anything back because it can't. And I think what looking at it in light of the cross invites us to is to say, this is not the real God. This violence, this attempt to win by force and by domination cannot save us. And so we have to turn to the way God actually chooses to save us, which is not through domination, but through mercy.
All right. It's a good place to end. Thank you so much for joining, Sam. And thank you, JD.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah.